Greetings, good people of this proud land of Africa. If a question were to be posed, what was Mfecane or Difaqane? The most likely response you would get to this question is, it was the displacement of Africans in Southern Africa, especially in the east of Southern Africa, caused by uShaka Kasenza Ngakona as he was expanding his Zulu nation. It was caused by communities fleeing battles against uShaka Kasenza Ngakona. But is that really what happened? And should this Mfecane Difaqane be ascribed to Africans? My name is Fana Mokoena, and this is Upheaval. Let's talk about it. Good people, let me start by saying, like and subscribe to this channel so that we can grow the channel and grow our discussions and conversations. We're developing a very nice community of people who are responding to the episodes, making inputs, very valuable inputs. And so the discussion is ongoing, but we need to grow the channel. And to do that, you must play your part by liking and especially subscribing to this channel. Now, today I have a bit of a flu. I'm not sure where it's coming from because we're in the middle of summer. But if my voice sounds a bit strange to you, don't worry, it's sounding very strange to me too. So today we're going to discuss the issue of, I promised this at the beginning of the channel, that we're going to discuss Mfecane and so-called Difaqane. But today, I'm not going to delve too deep into the subject. In fact, I wanted to keep this episode between 10 and 15 minutes, just so that I can jog your interest on the subject. So that when we come back to the real discussion, then at least you would have applied your mind to it. We're going to do that with the first 4 episodes that we've had so far have just been introductory. I'm sure you've heard every time we start the episode, I say this is an introductory episode. So, today we discuss Mfecane Difaqane. I promised at the beginning of the channel that we're going to tackle this subject, but today I want to keep it very short. In fact, if I can keep between 10 and 15 minutes, just to jog your interest on the subject. You will have noticed that in the past 4 episodes, we've just been introducing subjects so that we can come back to them once you've subscribed and we have grown the channel. But today, I just wanted to pick your mind on the subject of Mfecane Difaqane. Now, like I said in the beginning of the introduction, Mfecane Difaqane is almost wholly ascribed to uShaka Kasenza Ngakona and Africans fleeing his battles. What historians have not told us throughout the years is that these are not the only factors that have given rise to this era. In fact, I question the relevance of even naming the era Mfecane or Difaqane. But historians so far have ascribed it to the expansion of the Zulu nation and other nations fleeing Ushaka in this period. But I want to name, there are many other factors that have affected this era. But I want to name four main ones just for you to go back and think about it. So the four are, one is the slave trade in Dilagwa Bay, or what is now called Maputo. The second is the guns and horses trade, which mainly started in the Cape Colony and then made its way up to the east. The third reason is the Boer and the English settlements. Well, mostly the Boer settlements because they happened smack bang within the so-called Mfecane, Difaqane era. And then the English followed later. The fourth reason are the frontier battles of the Eastern Cape, which have affected communities. These frontiers took 100 years, but they have affected African communities over that time. But we're going to concentrate mostly on four of these frontier battles. There were about 9, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But we're going to concentrate on 4, which also fell within this period of Mfecane, Difaqane. So, just to get ourselves on the same page, Difaqane, Mfecane happened largely between 1810, 1815 to around 1840 and just afterwards. So that's the period that we're talking about when we're discussing this period. Now, in what used to be called Dilagwa Bay, which in modern terms is Maputo, the Portuguese occupied this land. In fact, they then later occupied, or rather colonized, the whole of Mozambique. But they were concentrated around this Dilagwa Bay, and this was around 1781. And around 5-10 years later, they then started the slave trade in Dilagwa Bay. It became the hub of slave trade. So they were trading with slaves, especially from North Africa, and they were selling them to either Brazil or the Mascarene Islands. Those were the big markets there. And so in 1810, the demand for slaves increased exponentially. And so there was a need for the expansion of the slave trade. And so, as Brazil and the Mascarene Islands were demanding more slaves, the Portuguese had to produce more slaves. And to produce more slaves, they had to abduct a lot more people from their communities. And this caused major upheavals in communities, especially in the south of what is now called Mozambique and the north of KZN. The slave trade caused a lot of distrust amongst communities, it caused many battles for resource between communities. And I just want to mention two leaders of the time whom we will discuss in detail in another episode. The first is Soshangane, and the second was uZwanendaba of Amangoni. Now, there's a difference between Amangoni and Amanguni. And we will discuss that again in another episode. But uSoshangane no Zonendaba, it is said, we have not confirmed this, but it is said that they then assisted the Portuguese in the slave trade. At first, they were assisting the Portuguese, and then they got themselves involved, personally involved, in slave trade. But we will discuss this a little bit further. Now, this period caused major disturbances between communities at the time. And this is part of what caused the displacement of people. Now, you can get more information around this era of slave trade, especially around the Delagwa Bay, from Iziko Museums, which has done amazing research work on the subject. They're supported by the National Library, by the National Archives of South Africa, by the University of Cape Town. Very well versed on the subject. The second factor I wanted to discuss is guns and horses trade. Now, as the Cape Colony was established in the Cape, there were two places, Griqua Town and Philippolis, where, because the European needed cattle and land and so on and so forth, they then traded with the Griquas and the Kuranas in exchange for these commodities. And so the Griqua and the Kuranas were armed with guns and horses at a very early stage. And this caused much chaos, starting in what is now the Northern Cape. But they then followed the Voortrekkers, and then later on the English, as they moved further up through the Free State into what is now called Natal. So the Griqua, in fact, in one of the books, in fact, I speak a lot about this book called The Basutos, written by Eugene Casali, a French missionary. If I'm not mistaken, it's either in the introduction or in one of the first chapters, where Eugene Casali gives an account of Moshweshwe in battle with the Kuranas, and saw live for the first time the effects of the guns and horses, because they were being used by the Kuranas. And he then sought to find these two weapons. But we'll come back to that at some stage. But guns and horses caused a lot of chaos in Southern Africa at the time. And when they reached the east, which is the now called KZN, it then added to the chaos that was already caused by all these other factors that we're about to discuss. So that is the second factor. The third factor was the Boer settlements. So the Boers traveled from the Cape, where they were fleeing from Cape Colony rule. They did not want to be subjects of the Cape Colony. And so at first they settled around the Caledon River, which is in Lesotho. In fact, it is said that for many years, the so-called Basotho and the Voortrekkers lived alongside each other for many years. I think it's about 10 years or so. In which a time in which the Voortrekkers were living just south of the Caledon, and Basotho obviously took the rest of the land north of the river. So they settled there for many years until things got difficult between the two around the 1850s, when we started seeing major battles between the Boers and the English. There were 4 battles between these two groups. There were 2 battles between the Boers and Basotho, and 2 battles between the English and Basotho. And in all these 4 occasions, Basotho won these battles. So the Boers then started moving a little bit further to the east, right? And they obviously, because there were many communities living in that area, land grabs and dispossession of land became a problem. Because naturally, that's what would have had to happen. The Boers would need to grab land from existing owners of land and dispossess them of cattle and so on and so forth. And so this caused major battles between the two. Most of them were small battles, but the biggest one was the Battle of Blood River, which happened in the late periods of Mfecane. Communities were scattered. In Lesotho, there was an influx of what was then called Matebele. There were then Baputing, Amahlubi in the Eastern Cape, Amangwane, and so on and so forth. So communities were displaced in a huge way, caused not by Africans, not by Ushaka Kasenza Kakona, but by land grabs and by dispossessions. That's the third factor. The fourth factor was the frontier battles in the Eastern Cape. I think there were around 8 or 9 of these battles, if I'm not mistaken. But we'll concentrate on just 4 of them, which happened in this time that we're talking about, between 1810 and just after 1840. The first one was the Fourth Frontier. The second one was the Fifth Frontier War. The third one is the Battle of Amalende, which I've done a bit of research on. And then the fourth one was the War of the Axe. sometimes called the Seventh Frontier War. Now, these are battles between especially the English and Amaxhosa, in which the English wanted to dispossess land from Amaxhosa. I think it was 100-year long battle, with these smaller Nyana battles happening every now and then. But the span of these battles was 100 years. And in the end, Amaxhosa were defeated, but literally after 100 years. But these battles as well displaced a lot of communities. Some, in fact, most of them that fled would go north. North is the Free State, it's modern-day Lesotho, and it's KZN as we know it today. This is part of the mix of the so-called Mfecane or Difaqane. All these movements caused a major era of upheavals. And we cannot discount the movement of people like Umzilikazi and so on and so forth. I mean, these were obvious battles between Africans themselves. However, in conclusion, because I did say that I want to keep the episode very short, I'm sure we've gone over 30 minutes by now. I want to introduce you to a man by the name of Julian Cobbing, who was a writer or is a writer on our history. And he has made a lot of commentary on the Mfecane. But he's a writer from the 80s and the 90s, so he's pretty recent. And he makes the point that historians have been dishonest with the history of Mfecane. In fact, let me just read what he says. He says, the Mfecane is a characteristic product of South African liberal history used by the apartheid state to legitimate South Africa's racially unequal land division. Some astonishingly selective use or actual invention of evidence produced the myth of an internally induced process of black-on-black destruction centering on Ushaka and his Zulu people. I think in reflection, this could be said much about the whole of our history as it was written by dishonest historians. My last thought, which is my own thought, is I don't understand why this period was even given a name, Mfecane or Difaqane. I think in semi-nomadic communities, and I'm not saying that Southern Africans were nomadic. I think some of them were semi-nomadic, but they were pretty much established communities with empires and kingdoms and so on and so forth. But even under those conditions, if there's famine or there's battles or something changes in the climate or there's an earthquake, people move. It's a natural instinct of society that when something feels uncomfortable where you are, especially at that time, you move. And so I don't understand why if there was something special about this period that we even had to give it a name. But that's just me. That's just my thoughts. Like I said, do comment. Let's continue having these discussions. We're going to come back, like I said, and investigate these issues a little bit further. And so, in the meantime, I again want to suggest, and it's purely a suggestion, that you like and subscribe to the channel so that we can grow it even further. My name is Fana Mokwena, and this was Ifo.